Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Today we are going to be talking about tabletop role-playing games, focusing on Dungeons & Dragons as a model. Typically, when people think about people who play these type of games, they think of the nerdy, pimple-faced kids in their mother's basements that have no life. This could not be further from the truth. The fan base of Dungeons & Dragons includes many more people than that, and a lot of them you would not even realize. I know a mother of 4 children that every week comes to a local meeting to play, even with her 1-month-old in tow. And in turn, I also know a 15 and 17-year-old that sit down at the same table to play with her. At the same time, I know there's also a video stream that shows big-name actors such as Vin Diesel who also play D&D. So what is this mythical game that has been bringing people together for over 40 years now? That's what we're here to find out. Dungeons & Dragons is a tabletop role-playing game that was developed by Gary Gygax in 1974 that encourages players to use their imagination and problem-solving. To further explain how this whole world of fantasy works, we will dig deeper into the origins and creation of the game, what the players' roles are, what the game master's role is, and how the gameplay works. To start off with, we will delve further into how the game came to be. In 1967, Gary Gygax founded the International Federation of Wargaming as a venue for wargaming fans to exchange ideas and designs. The following year, Gygax hosted the first Lake Geneva Wargames Convention, known as Gen Con now, in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. A few years later, Gary Gygax forms the Castle and Crusade Society, focusing on his own growing interest in the medieval period. Over the next 4 years, Dungeons & Dragons is formed through many iterations and released in January of 1974. Within 11 months of its initial release, the entire hand-assembled print of 1,000 games sells out. The next 2 years brings another 8,000 copies to the market, and continues to sell out. In 1977, Dungeons & Dragons split into 2 different versions, Basic and Advanced. TSR Hobbies, Incorporated, formed in 1977, publishes the first Monster Manual. This first book goes on to influence the fantasy game genre both on tabletop games and computers. In 1978, the Player's Handbook, which provides players with ideas and information on how to create characters, is released. And finally, in 1979, TSR releases the 3rd hardcover core book, The Dungeon Master's Guide. This company would continue to build upon these 3 basic core books, with many additions, including the first licensed computer adaptation of the AD&D system in 1988, published by Strategic Simulations Incorporated, until 1989, when the 2nd edition of Dungeons & Dragons is released. Continuing on with this version for the next 8 years under the guidance of TSR, until 1977, when the big-name Wizards of the Coast purchases TSR, bringing Dungeons & Dragons under the Wizards of the Coast banner. While under Wizards' banner, the game would continue to grow and evolve, bringing forth the 3rd, 3.5, 4th, and 5th edition of the tabletop game, as well as several computer and console-based games. Now that we know where the game came from, let's look at what's needed to play, and how to play the game. To this end, we are going to start with looking at what is needed to play. If you are a player, you only need a few things: a character, a set of dice, a rule book, and lastly, your own imagination. The character is the player's avatar within the game. The player takes on this role in the story, choosing what actions that character will do. When it comes to the dice, the player needs 7 different dice: a 20-sided, 12-sided, 10-sided, 8-sided, 6-sided, and 4-sided dice mostly. These can be picked up at a local game shop for only a few dollars. A copy of the current player's handbook has all of the current game rules and information that a player would need to create a character. These can sometimes be found online or bought from the same place as a dice or a local bookstore. The last thing you need, only you can bring, and that's your imagination. The player has a few choices when it comes to creating their avatar. These choices come to what role they want to play, what race they want to play, what skills their character will have, and lastly, what equipment they want to use. Normally, when creating a new character, the player starts with what class they want to play. A class is basically their job in the group. These choices fall under different names, but they break down into a defender, a healer, and those who deal damage. The defender's role is to protect the group from the enemies, while a healer's role is to keep the party alive. And lastly, the damage dealer's role is to deal damage to the enemies. Please understand that this is a very general explanation of a player's role, and they are not entirely set in stone. I personally play a defending healer in the game I am currently playing in. The race that you choose can give you special abilities or increase or decrease some of your attributes. These attributes are what determines your character's strengths, your ability to know or to gain knowledge and learn knowledge, your ability to influence other people, and basically how much health you have. The skills that the player chooses affects how well the player can do certain actions. These actions can include, but are not limited to, intimidating or persuading non-player characters, hiding from enemies, or how much the player knows about a specific thing. The last thing that the player chooses during their creation of their avatar is what equipment they want to use. This includes what weapons and armors the player has access to, as well as any other things the player may need during their adventure. On the other side of this game, and who the players play against, is the game or dungeon master. This person's role is to run the game, choose the actions of the enemies of the players, as well as play any of the non-player characters that the players come across. This person also has to be a storyteller and guide the players through the story. The game master has a couple of choices when it comes to their story. They can create their own story, in which case they create everything from the story to selecting what enemies the players will face. The other option available to the game master is choosing a campaign that was created by the publishers. The game master also needs to have a copy of the Dungeon Master's Guide, which again can sometimes be found online or at a local game or bookstore, their own set of dice, as well as a familiarity with the story that he will be telling. The last thing we're going to talk about is the actual gameplay. As stated earlier, the player and the game master are telling a story together. Typically, the game master will present choices for the players to make, and depending on those choices that the players make, and moves the story forward. As the players move through the story, they will run across hostile creatures which they must either combat or avoid, characters they must interact with to gain information or for help, and ultimately find their way to the end of the story. Unfortunately, for some players, the end of the story may not actually come at the end of the storytelling. This is where the dice come in. Through the game, a player's success at an action is determined by the roll of one of the dice, most often the 20-sided die. It is possible for a player who rolls poorly to have their avatar die in the game. At this point, a player normally has to create a new character, and the game master has to figure out how to work the new avatar into the game. As a game master, this can be a very difficult situation, for several reasons. Firstly, as a player continues to play a character, they can become attached to that character, and if that character dies, the players can be upset. But at the same time, if the story is not challenging enough for players, they will get bored and not want to play. Because of these two reasons specifically, a game master has to be very fluid in the choices he or she makes and how he approaches the situations that he brings before the players. In conclusion, there are games for all players regardless of your experience. A lot of the groups that I know and participate with always welcome players of any experience level. Most are very sociable and willing to teach anyone how to play. So with all of that being said, regardless if you're just looking to play the game or you're looking to run your own game, get out there and do it. Broaden your horizons. And remember, with tabletop games, the only true limitation is your own imagination.